And welcome back to Brussels for the second part of Talking Europe. My guest today is Karel de Gucht. The EU Commissioner for Trade has just returned from China, where he urged the leaders there to open up their market to global trade. Now, this comes at a time where an increasing number of Europeans are calling for a more protectionist attitude towards China. Now, in this programme, we'll also talk about ACTA, a controversial anti-piracy agreement. Mr. de Gucht, thank you for having us here at the Commission. I add that you also served as Minister of Foreign Affairs in your native country, Belgium, of course, but we'll focus today on Europe. And let me start with the latest developments in the Eurozone crisis. This week, the Eurozone finance ministers adopted a new rescue plan for Greece, 130 billion euros. We'll talk about this, but first, let's have a look at our report. As we will see, of course, this will prevent a disastrous default for Greece in March, but some analysts warn that the crisis is far from over. Yuka Royer reports.
A sigh of relief for Greece as marathon talks came to an end. Eurozone finance ministers have finally agreed on a 130 billion euro bailout package for the country.
This will give Greece the time needed to follow a credible path of fiscal consolidation and structural reforms and allow a return to sustainable growth and employment.
The deal enables Greece to avoid a messy default when its next bond repayment, worth 14.5 billion euros, falls due on March 20th. But it's a hard pill to swallow for many. The Greek public faces painful cuts in salaries and pensions, and private lenders will have to write off more than 53% of the money Greece owes them. Official sector creditors like the European Central Bank have also agreed to pay their share, foregoing some profits on their Greek bond holdings to help fill the remaining gaps. Doubt remains among European officials over Greece's ability to keep its promises. The international financial backers say they will tighten their control over Greece's spending.
The Commission will reinforce the task force for Greece, in particular on the ground in Athens, in order to ensure that Greece has the institutional means to carry out the new programme successfully.
The EU says the new bailout money will be managed through a separate account to ensure it's spent adequately to service Greece's debt.
Karel de Gucht, this is a second bailout plan for Greece in less than 2 years, 130 billion euros. Will this be sufficient to save Greece from bankruptcy?
This is a very interesting question, because this was a necessary plan, but there is not a plan that in itself can get out a country from a crisis. I mean, it's not by partly bailing them out, because that's in fact what is happening, that you instill growth in an economy. So you need both. On the one hand, you have this program. Together with the first tranche, it's 230 billion euros, which is an enormous amount. But if we are not in a position to instill growth in the Greek economy, then this will be a never-ending story. So the real problem, I believe, with Greece is how are we going to get new growth for this country? How are we going to get at least a certain numbers of industrial and services sector competitive? That's the real point. But you cannot get to that competitivity unless you first resolve the financial problem. That's now largely done. But if we do not manage to revamp the country as such, then it will have no result.
But what guarantees do you have that the Greek leaders, whoever they are after the elections in April, will abide by what they pledged to do and will deliver reform? Because there's been a great deal of disappointment so far.
I think you should look at that from another angle. The sacrifices that the Greek population is making are enormous. If now the Greek politicians were not to deliver on the reforms and on giving a new chance to their country, I think they would in a very awkward position. So they will be forced to take the necessary measures by the fact that their populations are awaiting that. Population realizes that unless there is decisive political action, that it will get from bad to worse. So there is not only the moral obligation of the politicians, and there is no reason that the politician would not be a moral person, by the way, but there is also the obligation by the facts that will drive them towards reforms.
Now let's leave Greece and talk about a completely different story, ACTA. This is a controversial anti-piracy agreement now. For those who aren't familiar with ACTA, ACTA stands for Anti-Counterfeiting Agreement. The aim, of course, is to crack down on the trade of counterfeited goods, including copyrighted material online. Now, Mr. de Gucht, this ACTA treaty has caused a lot of anger among rights activists. They link it to some kind of a super big brother that will infringe on freedom of speech on the internet. You have recently decided to ask the European Court of Justice to rule whether it is indeed illegal, whether it doesn't infringe European principles. Do you have any doubts about this?
The people that oppose this agreement say that it's infringing on their on the freedom of speech, on the freedom of access to information, on data protection. Now, all these items are about fundamental rights. So I thought that the only way to get out of this discussion in a rational way was to ask the European Court of Justice a very simple question. Is it true that this agreement is going to infringe on fundamental rights? Because if that were the case, I wouldn't agree to it either. I'm personally convinced that this is not the case, and for good reasons. But of course, we also have to convince the public and those that oppose the treaty, and that's why we have gone to the European Court of Justice.
But even here in the Commission, one of your colleagues, Viviane Reding, was in charge of justice, has openly outlined her worries. She wrote on Twitter, "For me, blocking the internet is never an option." You have a lot of European member states who don't want to sign the treaty, including Germany and the Netherlands. So surely there must be something wrong.
But the ACTA agreement is not about blocking the internet. There are countries where you have national legislation where that is possible, for example in France. Avec la législation applaudie, so the three strike, there it's possible, but this is not part of ACTA. This is a national legislation.
Then why doesn't Germany want to sign and ratify the treaty?
What a number of countries have been saying is that they want to have a second look, because in a democracy, I believe it is normal that if there is a lot of opposition, that you have a second look. I find it quite normal. And democracy is also about convincing the public that what you are doing is right. And I will convince them that this is right. But on the other hand, you must not expect me to say that a certain number of provisions would be in the treaty that are not there at all. And by the way, Viviane Reding, when we discussed this yesterday in the college, has been the first to support me to go to the European Court of Justice and taking exactly the same line that I have been taking, because also I would be completely against possible banning of somebody from the internet.
What will happen if the European Court of Justice rules that there is a problem with ACTA?
If the European Court of Justice is of the opinion that there is a problem, then that problem will have to be remedied. I mean, we are a union that is based on the rule of law. If the highest judicial court in the European Union would see problems in the treaty, then we will have to remedy it. But I'm quite confident that this will not be the case. On the other hand, I believe it's very important that the European Court of Justice would be the balancing between the freedom of speech, freedom of access to information, data protection, but also the right to property, intellectual property, and that they balance one fundamental right against another, because there is no fundamental right that is absolute, doesn't exist. So it will be a very important ruling, I believe, by the European Court of Justice. It's not just saying yes or no, it's really about indicating what is the framework within which we have to situate that kind of treaty.
Another story which has been grabbing headlines this week is, of course, Hungary. The Commission threatened sanctions against Budapest because of an excessive budget deficit. Hungary could lose up to 500 million euros if it failed to cut public spending in the coming months. This is, of course, an illustration of this new scheme of sanctions against budget sinners. Do you think it's the right way to go? Isn't there a risk that Europeans will start to perceive the Commission as some sort of headmaster?
But it's not a scheme of sanctions, we are taking up the responsibility that a certain number of member states have not been taking up. And we, of course, then if we do not take care, we will be the scapegoat. Huh? If we have to take measures, it is precisely because a certain number of member states have been sinning in the past, you know, and didn't live up to their obligations. And Hungary is an example. They have an excessive deficit since they have become member of the European Union, by the way. So this is completely going in the wrong direction. And yes, we have now been empowered. The European Commission has been empowered to take that kind of measures and to propose them to the Council of Ministers. And I think we have to do that. But we are doing our task, we are doing our duty. That's what we are for. Huh? It's not because we like this. If the member states were a little bit more vigilant, we wouldn't have to do that.
You've recently travelled to China, where you've urged the Chinese leaders to open up their market to global trade. There is a sense, indeed, that the Chinese do not reciprocate the openness that Europe has shown to China. Now, what guarantees did you receive that things are going to change in the future?
None. I mean, the answer is very simple. But I didn't expect to get guarantees on that either. What we have been telling them is that they have to open their markets, that, for example, for the investment agreement that they would like to discuss with us, it will not only about investment protection, it will also be about what we call market access, opening their markets to our products and to our investments. And that we have to do this on the basis of reciprocity. That's also why my colleague Michel Barnier and myself have been proposing a tool whereby if they close their public procurement markets, which are huge in China, of course, that we could take a measure by which we also do the same with certain chapters of our public procurement markets to the Chinese.
You're talking about...
it's not protectionism, it's about forcing them to open their markets.
You're working on a legal response to how would that work, very concretely?
It's of course very technical stuff, but very concretely it means that if a Chinese company wants to participate in the bidding in Europe, and in that the same kind of sector of markets is not open in China, that the European Union, only the European Union, not a member state, can take a measure by which we would close that sector of the public procurement market, European public procurement market, which is, by the way, the most open one in the whole world, that it would be close to them. So, but the idea is not protecting ourselves. The idea is protecting ourselves to the extent that we want also to have access with our products and with our investments to the Chinese market.
Do you understand why more and more Europeans are starting to wonder whether we were right to open our borders, to open our market? Because the feeling is that there is no reciprocity at the moment.
The reason that we are still the biggest economy in the world and that, for example, we have not been losing market share in trade contrary to, for example, the United States, is precisely because we have open markets. The idea that Europe would be better off with closed markets, with protectionism, is utterly wrong. On the other hand, we should not be naive, you know. It's not because you are in favor of free markets that you necessarily should be naive. I'm not a naive person at all. But my philosophy, my starting point is we have to force the others to open their markets, because it's only on the basis of open markets that you can have growth.
There's also a feeling that increasingly Europe needs China when it comes to cash. China has hinted that it could well contribute to our bailout fund, putting money on the table to help Europe's ailing economies. Where do things stand nowadays? Do you get a feeling that the Chinese are ready to help Europe?
I start from the assumption that if China does it, it will be in their own interest. And in fact it is. Whether that means that they will do it, that's another question.
But no guarantee so far that they will contribute to the ESM and to the EFSF?
Not to my knowledge. And in any case, for me, there is not a trade-off. It's not because they would do so that all of a sudden I would have another opinion on their protectionist attitude.
So no bargaining on that. And one last question about Iran. We know that Europe has decided to enforce an embargo against oil imports from Iran. It's due to take effect on July 1st. Now, the Iranians, as a retaliation, have told us that they will cut supplies to Europe much earlier. Surely this is no good news for Europe. Are we prepared? Are we prepared to live without Iranian oil right now?
They try to force us to change our position, of course, but I think it would be completely wrong to do so. If they close the tap, okay, then we will have to take the necessary measures that there is no problem with European economy or European citizens. And I'm convinced that we can do so. It also, of course, will mean that there needs to be solidarity, but I think we can count upon that solidarity. We are not going to let us blackmail by the Iranians. I mean, that's not the way you do politics. You know, what the Iranians have to do is stop their nuclear program that at this moment in time is focused on developing a nuclear bomb.
So no.
And this you know, the remark that some are making, you said it also about Iraq, and afterwards it was not the case. In the case of Iran, it is like that. And there is ample proof, not only by political statements, but by the International Atomic Agency that has stated very clearly in its report that the whole rationale of this program is to get to a nuclear bomb.
So no backtracking on Iran. Karel de Gucht, thank you very much for talking to France 24. You're, of course, the EU Commissioner in charge of trade. Thank you for watching this edition of Talking Europe. From all of us here in Brussels, goodbye. Please stay on France 24 for more news.